A little girl ran to the collapsed man on the street. She had no idea the stranger she was saving was the millionaire who would soon change her life forever. The city was heavy with heat and noise, the kind that made the air feel thick and the ground shimmer. People hurried past one another without looking up, phones pressed to their ears, horns blaring in the distance, the rush of another ordinary day. In the middle of this chaos, a man collapsed on the steps of a shopping center. For a long moment, no one noticed. He had been walking briskly, his jacket perfectly pressed, his shoes polished, his phone still glowing with unread messages. Then suddenly, he staggered, pressed a hand to his chest, and fell to his knees. His briefcase hit the ground, papers spilling like snow across the concrete. He tried to take a breath but couldn't. His body refused to obey. The man's name was Andrew Collins, one of the wealthiest and most powerful CEOs in the country, but at that moment he was just another human being, fragile and alone. People began to glance over, some slowed, others pulled out their phones, but no one came closer. Maybe it was fear, or the assumption that someone else would help. Maybe it was indifference. A small figure, however, stopped. A little girl stood near the fountain, holding a half-eaten sandwich wrapped in a napkin. Her blonde curls framed a small, serious face, and her blue eyes widened when she saw him. She looked around, waiting for an adult to step forward, but no one did. Slowly, she approached him, her small shoes tapping against the pavement. The man's breathing was shallow, his face pale. She crouched beside him, her pink dress brushing against the concrete. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "Sir, wake up. Please. You just have pressure, right? That's what my grandma says happens when grown-ups get dizzy." She didn't know who he was, didn't know that his name was printed on the tallest buildings downtown, didn't know that his decisions affected thousands of people. To her, he was just a man lying on the ground, helpless. Andrew's eyes flickered open for a second, blurry and unfocused. He saw the outline of a child leaning over him, sunlight catching in her curls. For a brief, fleeting moment, it looked like something he hadn't seen in years, a face filled with innocence and concern. He tried to speak but could only make a strained sound. The girl looked toward the street, saw a pharmacy across the road, and ran. Her small legs moved fast, her curls bouncing, the sandwich forgotten on the ground. She burst through the pharmacy doors, breathless, and reached up to the counter, barely tall enough to see over it. "Please, sir," the man outside fell down. "He can't breathe right. I think it's his pressure. My grandma gets that, too. I need water, please." The pharmacist hesitated for a second, then grabbed a cold bottle from the fridge and handed it to her. Without another word, she ran back into the heat. When she returned, the man was still there, a few people standing nearby but doing nothing useful. She knelt down again, opened the bottle with small, trembling fingers, and touched it gently to his lips. "Here. It'll help." He blinked slowly, his vision beginning to clear. The sound of sirens echoed faintly in the distance, someone had finally called for help. But he couldn't look away from the little girl. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old, yet there was something steady in her gaze, something that seemed to hold him in place. She looked scared, yes, but also determined, like she was used to taking care of people even though she was just a child. His hand, trembling slightly, lifted toward her, not sure why he was doing it. She caught it between her small palms and said quietly, "You'll be okay. You just need rest. My grandma says people forget to rest." That made him want to laugh, but all that came out was a weak smile. Her innocence struck something deep inside him, a place he had sealed off long ago, the place that used to feel things. He had built his life on control, every hour planned, every risk calculated, every feeling pushed aside. But this little girl, who didn't even know his name, had walked straight past all of that. The ambulance arrived within minutes, red and white lights flickering across the glass walls of the shopping center. Paramedics rushed over, checking his pulse, asking questions he barely heard. The girl didn't move. She sat quietly beside him, her hands still resting in her lap. When one of the medics lifted him onto a stretcher, she stood up, clutching the empty bottle to her chest. "Is he going to be okay?" she asked. "He just needs rest," the medic said with a kind smile. She nodded, looking oddly satisfied, like she had been proven right. Andrew turned his head as they wheeled him away, and through the haze of exhaustion, he saw her still standing there, a small figure against the crowd, hair lit by the sun, watching him go. He didn't know then that this child would change everything. That one day, her voice would echo in his mind when he faced the darkest parts of his life. All he knew in that moment was the strange, pure warmth of her hand on his, and the quiet comfort of her words, "You just need rest." For the first time in years, he believed it. When Andrew opened his eyes, everything around him was unfamiliar. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air, the faint beeping of a monitor pulsed steadily beside him, and the ceiling above was a dull white. It took him a moment to realize he was in a hospital room. The last thing he remembered was the sound of traffic, a small voice calling out to him, and then nothing. His head ached slightly, but what hurt more was the hollow feeling in his chest, something that had nothing to do with health and everything to do with exhaustion. A nurse entered the room, smiling politely, and told him that he had fainted due to stress and exhaustion. His blood pressure had spiked, and his body had simply given out. She handed him a cup of water and reminded him that someone had already paid for his treatment. That made him pause. Someone had paid? When he asked who, she shrugged. "A little girl brought you here with the ambulance," she said. "She stayed until she knew you were awake." Then she added softly, "She said to tell you to rest more." Andrew sat in silence for a long time after the nurse left. The phrase repeated in his mind over and over, "Rest more." The girl's voice was still vivid in his memory, light, sincere, without hesitation. He wasn't used to anyone caring about him. People wanted his attention, his approval, his money, but not him. Not really. For the first time in years, someone had helped him without asking for anything in return, and that someone was a child. He pressed his palms together and let out a long breath. The room felt colder than it should have, but at least he could breathe again. Later that evening, his assistant came to visit, panicked and carrying a stack of files. "Sir, you collapsed outside the center." "Everyone's worried," she said. "The board meeting was postponed, and," he cut her off gently. "Cancel everything for the next 2 days." She froze, clearly unsure if she'd heard him right. "Sir." He met her eyes for a moment, then looked away. 2 days, he repeated quietly. "I need to rest." The assistant left reluctantly, clutching the files like a shield, and Andrew leaned back on the bed. He hadn't taken a break in over 5 years, not since the expansion of his company began. He had lived on adrenaline, caffeine, and the illusion that he could handle everything. But as he lay there now, staring at the dim light filtering through the blinds, he realized that his entire empire meant nothing if he could collapse in the middle of the street and no one, not one real friend or family member, would be there to notice. The next morning, he signed the discharge papers and walked out of the hospital. His driver met him at the entrance, but before stepping into the car, he paused. "Take me to the address from the ambulance report," he said. The driver hesitated, confused, but nodded. The address led them through narrow streets to a small, worn-out neighborhood. Children played barefoot near the sidewalks, and laundry hung between buildings like faded flags. The car looked out of place here, sleek and black among rusted fences and cracked pavement. When they stopped, Andrew saw a little house with chipped paint and a garden full of wildflowers. It was quiet, almost too quiet. He stepped out and walked to the door, feeling strangely nervous. He didn't even know what he was going to say. "Thank you." That seemed too small. He knocked lightly, and after a few moments, the door opened. The girl from the street stood there, barefoot and wide-eyed. She recognized him instantly and gasped. "You're the man who fainted," she said, her voice filled with both surprise and delight. He smiled faintly. "And you're the one who saved me." She giggled shyly and stepped aside. "Grandma says helping people is what makes the world work." Her words hit him harder than he expected. She looked up at him with absolute sincerity, the kind that adults lose somewhere along the way. Inside, the house was small but warm. The scent of tea filled the air, and sunlight streamed through thin curtains. An old woman sat in a rocking chair, frail but smiling. "You must be the gentleman my Lily saved," she said softly. "Please, sit down." Andrew did, awkwardly at first, feeling strangely out of place in his expensive suit. The grandmother's eyes were kind, though tired. "You should take better care of yourself," she said. "You look like a man who hasn't rested in years." He wanted to deny it, but he couldn't. Lily climbed onto a chair beside him and handed him a cup of tea with both hands. "I made it myself," she said proudly. He took a sip and smiled. It was far too sweet, but he didn't mind. For a moment, everything felt still. The ticking of an old clock, the quiet hum of life outside, the warmth of the tea in his hand, it all felt painfully human. Lily told him about her school, about how her grandmother sometimes forgot to take her medicine, about the stray cat that came to their window every night for milk. Andrew listened, really listened, for the first time in a long time. When it was time to leave, he reached for his wallet, but the grandmother stopped him. "We don't need your money, Mr. Collins. Just visit again, if you want to. She doesn't have many people to talk to." On the drive back, Andrew stared out the window. The city looked the same, busy, impatient, full of noise, but something inside him had shifted. The image of that little girl's face, bright with honesty, wouldn't leave him. He didn't understand it yet, but somewhere deep inside, he knew that this small encounter would not be the last. That child, with her simple words and fearless kindness, had unknowingly awakened something in him that he thought had died long ago, a longing to feel alive again. The next few days passed in a strange haze for Andrew. He returned to his penthouse overlooking the city, but it felt emptier than ever before. The silence was almost unbearable, echoing through the glass walls and polished marble floors. Everything around him was perfect, but lifeless. He found himself sitting on the edge of his bed late into the night, replaying the memory of the little girl over and over again, the way her small hands had trembled as she opened the bottle of water, the worried look in her eyes, the way she had said, "You just need rest." Those words kept haunting him. He had been told by doctors, assistants, and even old friends that he needed to slow down, but it never mattered until that child said it with such honesty that he could not ignore it. He tried to return to his usual routine. Meetings filled his schedule again, people lined up to get his attention, and deals worth millions waited for his signature. Yet, while others talked about numbers and profit margins, his mind wandered elsewhere. He caught himself staring out the window during a board meeting, watching children walk past the building with their parents. He envied them for something he couldn't quite name. At lunch, he left early, ignoring the concerned look from his assistant, and got into his car. "Take me back to that neighborhood," he said quietly. The driver hesitated only for a moment before nodding. The streets looked smaller in daylight, full of life but burdened with poverty. He spotted the same little house with wildflowers growing unevenly in the yard. Lily was there, sitting on the front step with a doll in her lap, humming softly to herself. When she noticed the car, she stood up quickly, brushing off her knees. Andrew stepped out, unsure what to say, feeling awkward for the first time in years. She smiled shyly. "You came back." He nodded, his throat tight. "I said I would rest, didn't I?" She giggled, her laughter light and real, and motioned for him to sit next to her. He did, and for a moment, he felt strangely at peace, sitting there on that old wooden step in his expensive suit, surrounded by the smell of flowers and dust. Her grandmother soon came out, surprised but kind as ever. She offered him tea again, and they sat together in the small kitchen. He asked about Lily's parents, and the old woman's expression grew somber. "Her mother died when she was 3, she said softly. "A heart condition. Her father left after that, he couldn't handle it. I've been raising her ever since." Andrew lowered his gaze, guilt and sympathy washing over him. He knew what it was like to lose someone you loved. Years ago, he had lost his wife to illness too. Since then, he had buried himself in work, convincing himself that success would fill the void. But now, watching Lily chatter about her school and her cat, he realized how empty that had been. As he left that day, Lily handed him a small drawing she had made. It was of him lying on the ground and her giving him water, but both of them were smiling. "So you don't forget to rest," she said with a grin. He promised to keep it, and he did. He placed it on his office desk, right where the contracts used to pile up. That night, he couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet again, and for the first time, he didn't want quiet. He missed her laugh, her questions, her innocent honesty. He found himself thinking about her grandmother's frail hands and the look in her eyes when she spoke of responsibility and love. The next morning, he called his assistant and canceled a major meeting. Instead, he asked her to arrange a delivery of groceries and medical supplies to an address he dictated. "Make sure it's discreet," he said. "No company logos. No press." The assistant didn't question it. Over the following weeks, Andrew began visiting more often. At first, it was just to check on the grandmother's health or to bring Lily small things, books, coloring pencils, sometimes flowers for their tiny garden. But soon, the visits became something more. He started staying for dinner, sitting on the porch afterward as Lily told him stories about her classmates or asked him why stars twinkled. For the first time in years, he listened, not out of politeness or duty, but because he wanted to. Every moment in that small house felt more real than all the years he had spent chasing achievements. The mansion, the cars, the awards, all of it seemed meaningless compared to the sound of Lily's laughter. He didn't understand what was happening to him yet, but a quiet transformation had begun. He was no longer just the man who fainted from exhaustion on a busy street. He was someone being slowly pulled back to life by the kindness of a little girl who didn't even know she was saving him. As autumn settled in, the air grew cooler, and Andrew's visits became more frequent. At first, he tried to justify them to himself as simple acts of kindness, checking on the old woman's health, making sure the house had heating, bringing small things Lily might need for school, but deep down he knew it was more than that. Something about that small, imperfect home pulled him in every time he left his office. The mansion he returned to each night felt colder, emptier, and more meaningless. The contrast between his world of luxury and theirs of simplicity made him question everything he once believed about success and happiness. Lily's laughter echoed in his mind even during board meetings, and the image of her grandmother sitting in her rocking chair with a warm smile felt more grounding than any business deal could ever be. One afternoon, he arrived earlier than usual and found the yard empty. For a moment, panic rushed through him until he heard faint coughing from inside. He knocked softly and stepped in, finding the grandmother lying weakly on the couch. Lily was sitting beside her, a wet cloth in her hand, trying to keep her forehead cool. When she looked up and saw him, her eyes filled with relief. "She's just tired," the girl said in a small voice, though he could see the worry behind her words. Andrew immediately knelt beside the old woman, gently checking her pulse the way he remembered doctors doing for his late wife. Her skin felt cold. Without thinking, he took out his phone and called for a doctor to come immediately. Lily watched him with wide, frightened eyes as he reassured her in a calm, steady voice that everything would be all right. When the doctor arrived, he confirmed that the grandmother's condition was serious. She had been skipping her medication because she couldn't afford to refill her prescription. The words hit Andrew like a knife. How could such a kind, selfless woman suffer simply because of money, something he had in unimaginable excess? As the doctor left, Andrew promised to handle everything. He arranged for a private nurse to visit daily, paid for the medication in advance, and made sure the old woman would never have to worry about bills again. When Lily realized what he had done, she ran up to him and hugged him tightly, her small arms wrapping around his waist. "Thank you," she whispered. He hesitated, not used to affection, then slowly placed his hand on her back, feeling a strange warmth spread through his chest. Over the next few weeks, things began to change subtly but profoundly. Andrew started to spend more time with Lily while her grandmother rested. They would sit outside, and she would tell him stories, half real, half made up, about her dreams, her favorite books, and her mother, whom she remembered only through blurry childhood memories. Sometimes she would ask about his life, too, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he found himself telling her things he had never told anyone. He told her about losing his wife, about how he had thrown himself into work afterward because he didn't know how to live with the emptiness. Lily would listen quietly, never interrupting, her big blue eyes full of empathy. When he finished, she would simply say something like, "That's sad. But you still have a good heart. My grandma says hearts can heal if someone believes in them." Those words, so innocent and sincere, somehow lifted a weight off him every time she spoke. One evening, after visiting them, he returned home and walked through the marble hallway of his penthouse. The silence felt unbearable now. He stopped in front of the grand piano that hadn't been touched in years. His wife had once played it every evening, and he had closed it after her death, unable to listen to the sound again. But that night, he opened the lid, sat down, and placed his fingers on the keys. The first notes came out awkward, hesitant, but as he continued, something inside him began to loosen. The melody filled the room, echoing off the walls, and for the first time in years, he felt tears in his eyes. He didn't know if it was sadness, relief, or gratitude, maybe all of it. All he knew was that Lily's voice, her kindness, her quiet strength, had awakened a part of him he thought was gone forever. Days turned into weeks, and soon the grandmother's health began to improve. She would smile again and sit with them in the garden, wrapped in a blanket, watching as Andrew and Lily planted flowers. The neighbors sometimes whispered, surprised to see the rich businessmen spending so much time there, but Andrew didn't care. For the first time in his life, he wasn't living to impress anyone. He was simply living. Lily started to call him Mr. Andrew, and sometimes, when she was excited, she would forget the formality and just say, "Andy." It made him laugh every time. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of gold, Lily handed him a small daisy crown she had made. "Now you look happy," she said, smiling with pride. He looked at her, at the small miracle that had walked into his life without warning, and realized how right she was. For years, he had measured his worth in numbers and power, but sitting there, wearing a crown made of flowers by a 6-year-old girl, he felt wealthier than ever. And though he didn't yet know what the future would bring, deep inside he understood something important: he wasn't meant to save her, she had saved him. Winter arrived quietly, covering the city in a layer of white that softened even the harshest corners. For most people, the cold meant holidays and family gatherings, but for Andrew, it meant something entirely different this year. Instead of attending galas or investor dinners, he found himself spending his evenings in the small house with Lily and her grandmother, sipping hot cocoa by the fire. The old house creaked when the wind blew, and the heater hummed softly, but the warmth inside was more comforting than the perfect silence of his penthouse could ever be. Lily would sit cross-legged on the floor, coloring pictures or humming songs under her breath, and sometimes she would ask him to read to her. He hadn't read aloud in years, yet somehow, her small, expectant face made him want to try. The first time he read to her, his voice was shaky, but she listened as if every word mattered, and when he finished, she clapped and asked for another story. As the days passed, their bond deepened in ways he hadn't anticipated. He began to notice little things about her, how she always offered the last cookie to her grandmother, how she whispered kind words to the stray cat outside before closing the window, how she tilted her head when she was thinking hard. She reminded him of his late wife in ways that were both painful and healing. The same kindness, the same lightness of heart that once made him believe in something greater than success. One evening, as snow fell thickly outside, Lily climbed into the armchair beside him, pulling a blanket around her shoulders. "Do you think my mom can see me from heaven?" she asked softly. The question caught him off guard, and for a moment he couldn't speak. He swallowed hard and said, "Yes, Lily. I think she watches you every day. And I think she's proud of you." She smiled sleepily and leaned her head against his arm. "Then I'm happy," she whispered before drifting off to sleep. Andrew sat there for a long time after she fell asleep, watching the flickering light of the fireplace dance across the walls. He realized he hadn't felt this kind of peace since before his wife's death. It wasn't the grand, consuming happiness he used to chase, it was quieter, steadier, rooted in small moments that asked for nothing in return. He looked down at Lily, her tiny hand resting on his sleeve, and something stirred deep inside him. A sense of purpose that went beyond business, beyond money, beyond himself. For the first time in his life, he wanted to protect someone not out of obligation or guilt, but because his heart demanded it. A few days later, he received a call from his assistant reminding him about a charity gala hosted by one of his company's partners. He almost declined, but then an idea formed in his mind. He asked if he could bring guests. The assistant hesitated, surprised, but agreed. That weekend, he returned to the little house with a smile and a small box wrapped in gold paper. "I have something for you," he said, kneeling down beside Lily. Her eyes widened with excitement as she opened it to reveal a soft blue dress, elegant but simple, and a matching hair ribbon. "It's for a party," he explained. "I want you and your grandmother to come with me." She gasped and looked at her grandmother, who was already shaking her head gently. "Oh no, Mr. Collins, we don't belong in those kinds of places," the older woman said with a soft smile. But Lily turned to her pleadingly. "Please, Grandma. Just this once." On the night of the gala, Andrew arrived at their home himself, driving a modest car instead of the usual limousine. When they stepped outside, Lily's eyes sparkled with awe at the city lights. At the venue, people turned to look as they entered. Andrew, usually composed and distant at such events, felt oddly nervous. Lily held his hand tightly, her blue eyes wide as she took in the chandeliers and the glittering gowns. He could feel the curious stares of his colleagues, but for once, he didn't care. When someone asked who the little girl was, he simply said, "A friend." Throughout the evening, Lily behaved with the same natural grace that had first caught his attention. She thanked the waiters, complimented the musicians, and even made a group of serious businessmen laugh with her innocent questions. Watching her, Andrew felt something bloom in his chest that he hadn't felt in years: pride. Not the pride of accomplishment, but the pride of seeing goodness reflected in another person. Later, as the music slowed and couples began to dance, Lily tugged on his sleeve. "Can we dance too?" she asked. He hesitated, then smiled. "Of course." She stood on his shoes to reach his height, giggling as he guided her around the floor. The room seemed to fade around them, and for a moment, it was just the two of them, the powerful man who had everything but felt nothing, and the little girl who had nothing but gave him everything. That night, after taking them home, Andrew sat in his car for a long time before driving away. His reflection in the windshield looked different, softer. He realized that he wasn't just helping them anymore. They had become his reason to keep going. And as he drove back through the quiet streets, the snow falling gently on the city, he made a silent promise, to protect that little girl and her grandmother for as long as he could, not because he owed them, but because somewhere along the way, they had become his family. The following months brought subtle changes that no one around Andrew could ignore. The man who had once lived by strict schedules and ruthless efficiency now carried an unfamiliar calmness in his eyes. His employees whispered about how he smiled more often, how he stopped yelling when deadlines were missed, and how he seemed to take genuine interest in their lives. The board members speculated that perhaps he had fallen in love again, but they were wrong. It wasn't love in the traditional sense that had changed him, it was the quiet bond with a little girl and her frail grandmother that had slowly reshaped the man he thought he would always be. He began rearranging his priorities, shortening his workdays to visit them in the evenings, often bringing books for Lily and medicine for her grandmother. He told himself it was just temporary, just until they were stable again, but deep down he knew it was something permanent, something that had become an essential part of who he was becoming. One chilly evening, he arrived at their small house to find Lily sitting by the window, her chin resting on her knees, watching the snow. She didn't notice him at first, and for a moment he simply stood there, taking in the scene. She looked peaceful but thoughtful, her blue eyes reflecting the falling flakes outside. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly, setting down the groceries he had brought. She turned to him and smiled faintly. "I was wondering if people in heaven get cold," she said. Her innocence and depth caught him off guard as always. He knelt beside her, brushing a lock of hair from her face, and replied, "I think in heaven it's always warm, Lily." She nodded slowly, then looked up at him. "Do you think my mom can see you too? I think she'd like you." His heart tightened at her words. "I hope so," he said quietly, unable to hold back the lump in his throat. The grandmother, though improving, still struggled with her health, and there were days when she grew too weak to get out of bed. On those days, Andrew stayed longer, helping with meals, fixing things around the house, or sitting beside Lily while she did her homework. He found comfort in the routine, in the sound of the kettle boiling, in the way Lily would hum softly as she colored. One afternoon, while he was changing a light bulb in the hallway, she appeared beside him holding a crumpled drawing. "It's for you," she said shyly. He took it and unfolded it carefully. It showed 3 stick figures holding hands, one tall man, one small girl, and one older woman, under a bright yellow sun. He stared at it for a long moment, realizing that she had drawn him as part of their family. "This is the best thing anyone has ever given me," he said honestly, and she beamed with pride. That night, after tucking Lily into bed and saying goodbye to her grandmother, he sat in his car in silence. The drawing lay on the passenger seat beside him, and he couldn't stop staring at it. Something inside him ached with a mix of joy and fear. He had built his entire life on control, on avoiding vulnerability, yet here he was, completely undone by a child's drawing. He thought about his late wife again, how she had always told him that love wasn't about grand gestures or promises, but about showing up, day after day, even when it wasn't convenient. Back then, he hadn't understood what she meant. Now he did. He had shown up for Lily and her grandmother not because it made sense or served a purpose, but because it felt right. Because it filled a hole in his soul that nothing else ever could. A few weeks later, he invited them to visit his company. Lily's eyes widened as she stepped into the massive glass building, her reflection mirrored in every surface. The employees stopped what they were doing as they saw their boss walking hand in hand with a little girl. She was wearing a pink scarf and smiling shyly at everyone who greeted her. Andrew showed her his office, the view from the top floor, the polished desk, the wall of awards, and for the first time, he realized how meaningless all of it looked without someone to share it with. "This is where you work?" she asked, walking to the large window. "It's so high up." He nodded, smiling. "Yes, but it's very quiet up here. Too quiet sometimes." She looked up at him and said simply, "You should bring a cat. Then it won't be quiet." He laughed, the sound genuine and light, and his assistant who was standing nearby couldn't believe her eyes. No one in the company had ever seen Andrew Collins laugh before. That evening, after dropping them home, Andrew found himself thinking about the future for the first time in years. Not the future of his company or his investments, but the kind of life he wanted to live. He imagined Lily growing up, going to school, laughing, dreaming, becoming everything her mother never had the chance to be. He wanted to be there for that. To watch her grow, to protect her, to guide her, not as a benefactor, but as something closer, something that scared him to even name. A few days later, tragedy struck when he received a call in the middle of the night. The grandmother had suffered a heart attack. He drove there faster than he ever had before, his chest tightening with dread. When he arrived, the paramedics were already inside. Lily sat on the front steps in her pajamas, clutching her stuffed animal, tears streaming down her cheeks. Andrew ran to her, dropping to his knees and pulling her into his arms. "She's going to be okay," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if it was true. His heart broke at the sight of her trembling in the cold. The ambulance left moments later, and he took Lily to his car, wrapping his coat around her. As they drove behind the flashing lights, she looked up at him and whispered, "Please don't let her go, Mr. Andrew." His hands tightened on the steering wheel, and he made another silent promise, this time, not to the child, but to himself, that he would never let her feel alone in the world again. That night marked the beginning of something irreversible. He realized, as the snow fell and the sirens faded into the distance, that he could no longer return to his old life. The part of him that once believed money could fix everything was gone. All that remained was a man who had rediscovered what it meant to care, to feel, to love, and a little girl who, without even trying, had become the heartbeat of his world. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and rain. The world outside was a blur of gray and falling snow, but inside, time had stopped. Andrew sat beside Lily in the waiting room, his hand resting gently on her small shoulder. She hadn't spoken for nearly an hour, her blue eyes fixed on the doors that led to the intensive care unit where her grandmother was being treated. Every few minutes, she would fidget with the frayed hem of her pink scarf, a nervous habit he had noticed before, but this time it was different. This time, it came with the quiet trembling of a child who had already lost too much. Andrew didn't know how to comfort her. Words felt useless, too small to hold the weight of what she was feeling. So he just stayed there, silent but present, hoping that somehow his closeness would give her a sense of safety in a world that suddenly felt too big and cruel. When the doctor finally emerged, Lily jumped to her feet. Andrew rose beside her, his heart pounding, afraid to hear the answer. The doctor's face was calm but tired. He explained that the grandmother had survived the heart attack but her condition was fragile. She would need constant care and rest if she wanted to recover fully. Andrew felt a wave of relief, but when he looked down at Lily, she was staring at the floor, silent. Later, as they walked to her grandmother's room, he noticed that she wasn't smiling. "Aren't you happy, Lily?" "She's going to be okay," he said softly. She nodded but didn't look up. "I'm happy, but what if she gets sick again?" What if one day she doesn't wake up? Her voice broke, and he could see tears welling in her eyes. He stopped walking, knelt down in front of her, and held her hands. Then I'll be there, he said firmly. I promise you won't have to face it alone. Ever again. For a long moment, she just looked at him, as if trying to decide whether she could really believe those words, and then she threw her arms around his neck and whispered, "Okay." Over the next few weeks, Andrew arranged everything for the grandmother's recovery. He hired 2 private nurses, covered all medical bills, and made sure that the hospital provided the best care available. He even had a small room redecorated for Lily inside his penthouse, anticipating that she might need to stay there if things got worse. It was decorated in soft pink and white tones, with fairy lights around the window and a small bookshelf filled with stories. When she first saw it, she gasped, speechless. "This is mine?" she asked, almost afraid to believe it. "Yes," he said, smiling. "Only if you promise to fill it with laughter." For the first time in days, she laughed, a light, pure sound that broke through the heaviness that had been hanging over them both. The days became a strange mixture of sorrow and hope. Andrew would go to the hospital in the mornings before work, then return in the evenings with Lily to visit. Sometimes the grandmother would wake and smile weakly at him, whispering her thanks, but he would shake his head, unwilling to accept any credit. He knew deep down that it wasn't kindness or charity driving him anymore, it was love, real and consuming, the kind that grows quietly when you least expect it. He didn't want to imagine what life would look like without Lily or her grandmother. They had become his anchor, the part of his world that reminded him he was still human. One evening, after a long day at work, he found Lily sitting on the hospital steps, her little hands clutching a paper cup of cocoa. She was staring up at the sky, where the first stars were appearing. He sat beside her, the cold concrete seeping through his expensive suit, and for a while they said nothing. Then she spoke quietly, without turning to him. "Do you think my grandma will ever come home?" He looked up at the stars too, searching for the right words. "Yes, I do," he said at last. "But even if she can't for a while, we'll make sure she gets better. I promise you, Lily, she will have everything she needs." She nodded, then glanced at him. "You keep promising things," she said softly, "but you never break them. Grown-ups usually do." Her words pierced something deep inside him. He didn't realize until that moment how much her trust meant to him, how sacred it felt to be believed in after years of living in a world where everything was transactional. A week later, the grandmother was discharged from the hospital, though still weak. Andrew personally oversaw her move back home, but he insisted on one condition, that she and Lily move into a safer apartment he owned in a quiet part of town. He tried to make it sound like a practical decision, telling her it was closer to medical facilities, but the truth was, he couldn't bear the thought of them being too far away. The grandmother, wise enough to see through his excuses, smiled knowingly but agreed. "You have a kind heart, Mr. Collins," she said softly one evening as he helped her settle in. "But be careful. Once a child loves you, she never stops." He looked at her, startled by the weight of her words, then smiled faintly. "I'm counting on it," he replied. Days turned into weeks again, and slowly, life began to find its rhythm. Lily started attending a small local school, and every morning before dropping her off, Andrew would tie her scarf and listen as she told him what she planned to learn that day. The first time she ran back out of class to hug him goodbye, his chest ached in a way that felt both painful and beautiful. It reminded him of everything he had lost, and everything he had found again. The grandmother, though frail, began smiling more often, watching them together with quiet gratitude. Sometimes she would whisper to Lily when she thought he wasn't listening, "You see, sweetheart. Miracles don't always fall from the sky. Sometimes they walk in wearing a suit." But one night, as Andrew tucked Lily into bed, she looked at him with those clear, piercing eyes and asked, "Will you always be here?" He hesitated, caught off guard by the simplicity of the question. For a man who had built his life on promises written in contracts and signed in ink, this one, spoken softly by a 6-year-old, was the only one that truly mattered. He took her small hand in his and said quietly, "Yes, Lily. I'll always be here." She smiled, satisfied, and soon drifted to sleep. He sat beside her for a long time, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest, and realized with startling clarity that somewhere along the way, she had become his family. Not out of obligation, not out of guilt, but out of love, pure, unexpected, life-altering love. And as he turned off the light that night, he knew that no amount of money, power, or prestige could ever come close to the feeling of belonging he found in that tiny, warm room. Spring came early that year, and with it came a quiet sense of renewal that Andrew hadn't felt in decades. The city was coming alive again, trees lining the streets bloomed with delicate white petals, and even the air seemed softer, filled with warmth and something like forgiveness. Inside the new apartment, laughter had returned, and the silence that once filled Andrew's life had been replaced by the sounds of life, a kettle whistling, pencil scratching, the soft rhythm of a child's feet on the wooden floor. Lily had begun to smile again, her eyes bright with the kind of innocence that could survive even grief, and her grandmother's health had improved enough that she could sit by the window, sewing or reading, often watching the two of them with quiet gratitude. It was as if the three of them had built something together, a home not bound by blood, but by choice and love. Andrew's days no longer revolved around meetings and investors. He still worked, but the work no longer consumed him. He would leave the office early to pick Lily up from school, her backpack bouncing as she ran toward him, shouting his name. The first time she called him "Dad" by accident, he froze, unsure if he'd heard her correctly. She turned red, quickly muttering, "I mean, Mr. Andrew," but he just smiled, pretending not to notice the slip while his heart swelled with something deep and indescribable. That night, as he sat by her bedside reading her favorite book, she reached for his hand and said quietly, "You can be my dad if you want to." The words were so simple, yet they shattered something inside him, the last wall he'd built around his heart. "I'd like that very much," he whispered back, and for the first time in years, his voice trembled not from fear or anger, but from overwhelming love. As months passed, people around Andrew began to notice a transformation that went beyond demeanor. His company shifted focus toward charity initiatives and children's welfare programs. When questioned about the change, he simply said that some things mattered more than profit. What he didn't tell them was that every project, every donation, every decision was inspired by one little girl who taught him that kindness could save a life, and that love didn't have to be earned, it only had to be given. The man who once measured his worth in money now measured it in smiles, in moments, in the laughter echoing through a small apartment where he finally felt at home. One summer evening, they all went to the park. Lily ran through the grass barefoot, chasing bubbles that shimmered in the golden light. Her grandmother sat nearby on a blanket, smiling, and Andrew watched from a few feet away, hands in his pockets, heart full. It was one of those moments that seemed ordinary but felt eternal, the kind of moment that told you everything would be okay. Lily ran back toward him, holding a dandelion. "Make a wish," she said, thrusting it into his hand. He crouched down beside her, looked at her bright face, and said, "I already got my wish." She laughed, blowing the seeds into the air, and for a moment the world seemed suspended in that fragile beauty, each seed floating away like a small promise that everything painful in the past had led them right here. That night, as they walked home, Lily held one of his hands and her grandmother held the other. The city lights glowed softly around them, and he realized that he no longer felt like a visitor in his own life. For the first time since he could remember, he wasn't running from loneliness, he was walking toward something that felt like forever. When they reached the apartment, Lily fell asleep almost instantly, curled up with her stuffed bear. Her grandmother looked at him and said softly, "You've given her back her childhood." He shook his head. "No," he replied, glancing toward the sleeping girl. "She gave me back my life." Years later, when Lily stood on a small stage in her graduation gown, she looked out into the crowd until her eyes found his. Andrew's hair had grown grayer, his face lined with age, but his smile was the same, the one he reserved only for her. As she began her speech, her voice trembled at first, then grew steady. "When I was little," she said, "someone once told me that family isn't always who you're born with, it's who stays when everyone else leaves. I was lucky enough to find that kind of family, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be the same for others." Andrew couldn't stop the tears that slipped down his cheeks. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every moment of fear had led to this, to the proof that love, when given freely, could rewrite even the darkest story. After the ceremony, Lily ran to him and threw her arms around his neck just like she had all those years ago when he promised she'd never be alone. "I kept my promise," he whispered, his voice thick. "I know," she said softly. "And so did I." They stayed like that for a long moment, the world moving around them, and when they finally stepped apart, the sun was setting in a wash of orange and gold. The light caught her hair, and for a fleeting second, he thought of the scared little girl in the pink scarf who had changed everything just by existing. Life had come full circle, and though it had begun with pain, it ended with peace. That night, as the city lights blinked in the distance, Andrew sat by the window, listening to the sound of laughter drifting from Lily's room. The house felt alive, filled with warmth and stories and memories that would never fade. He realized that the man he once was, the man who had believed success meant solitude, was long gone. In his place was someone who finally understood what it meant to love selflessly, to live for more than himself, and to find redemption not in wealth, but in the small, tender hands of a child who had taught him the meaning of home.